He picked the most expensive table in the restaurant, smiling as he wrapped an arm around his mistress, loud enough for everyone to hear. Some people just aren't built for this life. Then he saw her, Evelyn, standing beside his table, calm, composed, taking his order like she meant nothing. And he smirked, thinking he'd already won. But the room felt off. Staff paused when she moved. The chef waited for her nod. And when he demanded the manager, the man walked over, looked past him, and said, "Ms. Carter, how would you like to handle this?" That's when Daniel realized he wasn't the one in control. He chose that table on purpose, the one under the chandelier, where everyone could see him. The golden light spilled across polished marble floors and crystal glasses, catching on the edge of silverware and the quiet confidence of a room that only welcomed those who belonged. Evelyn Carter stood near the bar, one hand resting lightly against the smooth oak counter, her reflection faint in the mirrored wall behind rows of aged bourbon. She had been here for hours already, moving through the restaurant like a shadow no one questioned, every detail of the night unfolding exactly as planned. The soft hum of conversation, the low clink of glasses, the distant sizzle from the kitchen, it all settled into a rhythm she controlled without ever raising her voice. Then the door opened. She didn't need to look to know it was him. Some presences never left your bones, no matter how many years passed. Daniel Brooks walked in like he still owned every room he entered, his posture sharp, his smile practiced, his hand resting confidently at the small of another woman's back. Sophie Lane, younger, polished, the kind of woman who looked like she belonged in glossy magazines and expensive mistakes. Evelyn's breath didn't hitch. Not anymore. She simply turned, picked up a leather-bound menu, and stepped forward as if he were just another reservation. Daniel's eyes found her the moment she reached the table. For a split second, something flickered. Recognition, maybe even surprise, but it vanished beneath a familiar smirk. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, his voice just loud enough to carry, "I didn't expect to see you here working." The word lingered, coated in something subtle but sharp. Sophie glanced between them, curious, amused, already forming a judgment she didn't need to. "Speak out loud." Evelyn met his gaze, her expression calm, almost unreadable, the kind of composure that came from surviving something he never understood. "Good evening," she said evenly, her voice smooth as the wine being poured across the room. "Can I start you with something to drink?" It was as if the past had been folded neatly and tucked away, out of reach. Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head as he reached for the menu without really looking at it. "Let's make it a good bottle," he said, glancing at Sophie, then back at Evelyn with that same quiet arrogance. "Something expensive. I'm celebrating." Evelyn nodded once, making a small note, her movements precise, unhurried. Around them, the room continued to breathe, but something beneath the surface had shifted. A server across the floor paused for just a second longer than necessary when she passed. The bartender's eyes flicked toward her before returning to his work. In the kitchen, a chef stepped closer to the line, waiting not for a command but for a signal. Daniel didn't notice. He was too busy performing, too certain of his place in a story he thought he had already finished. Evelyn turned to leave the table, her heels soft against the floor, her posture straight, her silence louder than anything he had said. And as she walked away, the entire room seemed to tilt, just slightly, around her, though he hadn't realized it yet. Daniel leaned back in his chair as if the entire restaurant had been arranged for his comfort, swirling the deep red wine in his glass before even tasting it, his eyes drifting toward Evelyn as she moved across the floor with quiet precision. And there was something about the way she carried herself that unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name. But he dismissed it just as quickly, because in his mind, he had already decided who she was in this moment. Just a woman who had fallen. Behind while he had moved forward. "You see that," he murmured to Sophie, nodding slightly in Evelyn's direction, his tone low but edged with that familiar condescension. "Some people just do not know how to keep up," and Sophie gave a soft laugh, polite and practiced, the kind that fits seamlessly into rooms like this. even if she did not yet understand the history she was stepping into. Evelyn returned. With the bottle, her movements smooth, her expression untouched, as if his words had never reached her. And when she poured the wine, her hand did not tremble, not even slightly, the liquid catching the warm chandelier light as it filled the glass. And for a brief second, Daniel noticed something else, the way the bartender straightened as she passed, the way another server paused just long enough to let her go first, small things, subtle things, but enough to create a faint crack in the version of reality he was holding on to. "We will take the chef's special," Daniel said, not bothering to look at the menu anymore, his voice louder now, as if volume alone could reinforce his importance and make sure it is done right. And the choice of words hung in the air, sharp but disguised as casual, and Evelyn simply nodded, writing it down without reaction, without hesitation, as if she had heard far worse and learned long ago that silence could be stronger than any reply. As she turned away, Sophie tilted her head slightly, watching Evelyn with a flicker of curiosity. "She seems different," she said quietly, and Daniel scoffed under his breath, waving it off with a small dismissive gesture. "People like her always are. They pretend they are fine, but you can tell." Yet even as he spoke, his gaze lingered a moment too long, following Evelyn as she crossed the room, and that strange feeling returned. Sharper now, like a detail just out of focus. In the kitchen, a line. Cook leaned in toward the head chef, whispering something under the low hum of ventilation, and the chef's eyes shifted immediately toward the dining room, toward Evelyn, waiting, and when she gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, the entire line seemed to move with renewed precision, as if a silent command had been given. Back at the table, Daniel checked his watch, impatience beginning to creep in, tapping his fingers lightly against the white tablecloth. "Service is slower than I expected," he muttered, and when Evelyn passed by again, he did not hesitate. "Excuse me," he called out, his tone carrying just enough authority to draw a few glances from nearby tables. "We have been waiting." And she stopped, turning toward him with the same calm expression, the same steady gaze, and for a moment the noise of the restaurant seemed to soften around them, like the room itself was holding its breath. "Everything is being prepared exactly as requested," she said, her voice even, controlled, and there was something beneath it now, something Daniel could not quite place, not defiance, not submission, but something else entirely, something that did not fit the role he had assigned her. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, but not enough to keep it private. "Just make sure it stays that way," he said, a faint smile touching his lips, the kind that had once convinced her he was charming, the kind that now felt hollow even to him. And as Evelyn held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the first sign of a storm you do not yet realize you are standing in the middle of. And when she finally turned and walked away, the room did not return to normal. Not completely, because now, even Daniel could feel it, that quiet, unsettling truth pressing in around him, that this night was not unfolding the way he thought it would. The plates arrived with perfect timing, each detail placed with the kind of precision that did not happen by accident, and Daniel barely glanced at them before speaking again, his voice carrying just enough edge to signal dissatisfaction. "Took long enough," he muttered, cutting into the steak without waiting, as if the food itself owed him something, and across from him Sophie smiled politely, though her eyes flicked once more toward Evelyn, who stood several feet away, speaking quietly with a man in a tailored charcoal suit, a man who listened carefully, nodding with a level of respect that did not match how Daniel had just treated her. Daniel followed her gaze this time, and something tightened in his chest, subtle but undeniable, as he watched the man step slightly aside, allowing Evelyn to move ahead of him, not as a courtesy, but as if she naturally held that position. And for the first time that night, Daniel felt the need to reassert control, to remind himself of where he stood, so he raised his hand slightly, gesturing with casual impatience. "Excuse me," he called again, louder now, drawing the attention of nearby tables. "I think we need to speak with the manager," and the words landed differently this time, not as a complaint, but as a test. There was a brief pause, almost imperceptible, before the same man in the charcoal suit turned and began walking toward their table, his posture straight, his expression composed, and Daniel leaned back, a faint smile returning, confident in the familiar rhythm of escalation and resolution, the kind he had navigated countless times before. But as the man approached, he did not look at Daniel first. He looked at Evelyn, just behind him, waiting. "Is there an issue with the table?" the man asked, his voice calm, professional, but his eyes did not leave her, and that was when the air shifted completely. Daniel frowned slightly, the script slipping from his grasp. "Yes," he said, clearing his throat. "The service has been inconsistent," but the words felt thinner now, less certain, because the man still was not reacting to him, not fully, and instead, he turned just enough to face Evelyn, his tone changing in a way Daniel could not ignore. "Miss Carter, how would you like to handle this?" And in that single moment, everything fractured. Sophie straightened in her seat, her expression sharpening with sudden awareness, while Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of his glass, the pieces falling into place too quickly, too late, and Evelyn stepped forward, not rushed, not dramatic, just steady, the light from above catching in her hair, outlining her in quiet certainty. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "There is no issue," she said, her gaze meeting Daniel's without hesitation, without anger, without anything he could use against her. "Everything is exactly as it should be," and the meaning settled between them, heavy and unmistakable. Daniel opened his mouth, then stopped, the realization pressing in from all sides, from the way the staff watched her, from the way the manager waited for her decision, from the way the entire room seemed to orbit her presence. And for the first time that night, he was not the one being seen, he was the one being measured. Evelyn let the silence stretch just long enough, then gave a small nod to the manager, a signal so subtle it could have been missed by anyone who was not paying attention. But the entire room seemed to respond to it, the tension easing, the rhythm returning, as if a balance had been restored. She turned back to Daniel, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, untouchable. "Your dinner is taken care of," she said simply, not as a favor, not as generosity, but as a conclusion. And without waiting for a response, she stepped away, her heels soft against the floor, leaving behind a table that no longer felt like his, a room that never had been, and a truth he could not undo, no matter how hard he tried to hold onto the version of the past, where he had been the one in control. Daniel did not touch the food after that. The perfectly plated dish in front of him might as well have been invisible, his appetite replaced by something unfamiliar, something tight and restless that settled just beneath his ribs and across the table. Sophie shifted slightly, her earlier confidence fading into a quiet, careful silence as she began to understand that whatever story she thought she had stepped into, she did not know the ending. Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing a small laugh that sounded thinner than he intended. "So she owns the place," he said, as if saying it out loud might make it smaller, more manageable. But the words only seemed to echo back at him, heavier each time. Sophie set her glass down gently, her eyes moving across the room, noticing now what he had missed before, the way people greeted Evelyn with subtle nods, the way conversations adjusted around her presence, not out of fear, but respect. And there was something in that realization that made her sit straighter, her tone quieter. "You did not tell me about her," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact that now carried weight. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze drifting toward the far side of the restaurant, where Evelyn stood speaking with a couple near the window, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, completely untouched by the moment she had just created, and that was what unsettled him the most. Not what she had said, but what she had not needed to say. "There is nothing to tell," he replied, a little too quickly, reaching for his glass again, though his hand paused halfway, the confidence he usually relied on slipping just enough to expose something beneath it, something uncertain. Sophie watched him for a second longer, then leaned back, her earlier smile replaced by something more measured, as If she were recalculating her place in the room, and Daniel felt it, that subtle shift, the way attention moved, the way control slipped, not in a dramatic collapse, but in small, precise increments he could not stop. Across the room, Evelyn turned slightly, her gaze passing over the dining area, and for a brief moment it landed on their table, not lingering, not challenging, just acknowledging. And Daniel felt it like a quiet weight, the kind that did not demand a reaction, but made one. Unavoidable. He looked away first. The check never came. Not in the way he expected. Instead, a server placed a small, folded card beside his plate. Simple, understated. And when Daniel opened it, there was no total, no itemized list, just a single line written in clean, deliberate script. Welcome back. And beneath it, her name, not signed with flourish, not emphasized, just there, steady and certain. Sophie leaned slightly to see, her brows lifting just a fraction, and for the first time since they had sat down, she did not look at Daniel for direction. She looked at the room again, at the quiet structure of it, the invisible lines of authority that now made perfect sense, and Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not anger, not quite regret, but the undeniable awareness that he had misunderstood everything the moment he walked in. He set the card down carefully, more carefully than he intended, as if even that small motion required thought now. And when he finally stood, the chair sliding back with a soft sound against the floor, it did not feel like an exit he controlled. It felt like a retreat he could not avoid. He glanced once more toward Evelyn, but she was already turning away, already moving into another conversation, another moment, another part of life that no longer included him. And as he walked toward the door, the warm light of the restaurant fading behind him, the realization settled fully, not sharp, not sudden, but absolute, that he had not just lost her once. He had lost the version of himself who ever believed he was the one she needed. The night air outside felt colder than it should have, a sharp contrast to the warm, controlled elegance Daniel had just stepped out of, and for a moment he stood on the sidewalk without moving, the city. Lights stretching out around him in long reflections across polished car windows and quiet streets. His mind replaying the last few minutes with a precision he could not turn off. Sophie lingered a step behind him, adjusting her coat, her silence no longer uncertain but deliberate, as if she had chosen to observe rather than participate. And Daniel felt it again, that subtle shift, the way the narrative he had built all evening no longer held its shape. "It is just a restaurant," he said. Finally, more to himself than to her, his voice steady but lacking the conviction he expected, and Sophie did not respond right away, her gaze drifting back toward the entrance they had just exited, the soft glow spilling out each time the door opened for another guest, each movement inside continuing without interruption, without acknowledgement of his departure. "Is it?" she asked quietly after a moment, her tone neutral, but the question landing with more weight than it should have, and Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, a gesture he had used countless times to regain control. But tonight it did not work the same way, because control had not been taken from him loudly. It had been removed piece by piece until there was nothing left to hold on to. Inside, Evelyn moved through the dining room with the same quiet certainty, her presence restoring a balance that had only briefly been disturbed. And as she paused near the window, she allowed herself a single breath that was deeper than the rest. Not relief, not exhaustion, but something closer to closure, the kind that did not need an audience. She had not planned for him to walk in, but she had prepared for the possibility that one day the past would try to reintroduce itself, and when it did, she would not meet it with anger. She would meet it with distance. A server approached her with a small question about a reservation change, and she answered without hesitation. Her focus already returned to the present, to the business she had built, to the life that no longer revolved around someone else's approval. Outside, Daniel finally started walking, each step measured, slower than usual, as if he were recalibrating without realizing it. And Sophie followed, but not as closely as before, the space between them widening in a way that neither of them addressed, because some things did not require explanation. "You never told me she built something like that," Sophie said after a few blocks, her voice thoughtful rather than critical. And Daniel stopped briefly at the corner, the red light reflecting faintly across his face as he looked ahead, not turning back this time. Not even once. She did not have anything when I left, he replied. And even to him, the sentence sounded incomplete, as if it belonged to a version of reality that no longer existed. Sophie studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if confirming something to herself rather than agreeing. And when the light changed, she crossed the street without waiting for him, her pace steady, her direction clear. Daniel remained on the curve for a second longer, the city moving around him, the sound of distant traffic blending into a low, constant hum. And for the first time in a long time, there was no immediate next move, no quick solution, no easy way to rewrite what had just happened. Back inside, Evelyn stood near the entrance as a new group of guests arrived, greeting them with the same calm professionalism, her voice warm, her presence grounded, and, as the doors closed behind them, the reflection in the glass briefly caught her face, composed, steady, unchanged, and in that quiet moment, it was clear that nothing about her success had been sudden. Nothing about her strength had been accidental, and the past that once defined her had been reduced to something smaller, something distant, something that no longer had the power to follow her into the life she had built on her own terms. The city did not slow down for him, not for a second, and that was what Daniel noticed most as he finally began to walk again. The rhythm of traffic, the quiet glow of streetlights stretching across wet pavement, the distant echo of conversations that did not include him, all of it continuing as if nothing had shifted, even though something had. He slipped his hands in his coat pockets, the cool night air pressing against his skin, grounding him in a way that felt unfamiliar, because for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what came next. He was thinking about what had already happened, replaying it in fragments, the look in her eyes, the way the room had moved around her, the silence that had carried more weight than anything he had said. Inside the restaurant, Evelyn stood at the center of her world, but not in a way that demanded attention, not in a way that pulled focus. Instead, she moved through it with a quiet authority that made everything else align naturally, her presence not loud, but undeniable. And as she stepped into the private hallway leading toward the back office, the sound of the dining room softened behind her, replaced by the steady, controlled calm she had built over time. She closed the door gently, resting her hand against the cool surface for just a moment longer than necessary, her reflection faint in the glass panel beside it. And for a brief second, the past brushed against her, not sharply, not painfully, but like a distant echo she could finally hear without reacting to. There had been a time when his voice would have unsettled her, when a single comment would have stayed with her long after the moment passed, shaping how she saw herself, how she moved through rooms, how she measured her worth. But that version of her had been left behind piece by piece, replaced not by something louder, but by something steadier. She moved further into the office, the soft overhead light illuminating a space that was functional, organized, hers, and as she set the evening reports on the desk, her hands remained steady, her breathing even, because nothing about tonight had disrupted what she had built. It had only revealed it. Outside, Daniel slowed near the corner of another block, his steps losing direction as he glanced back once, then stopped himself, forcing his gaze forward again, because looking back would mean acknowledging something he was not ready to name, something that had slipped through his control without confrontation, without resistance. And that unsettled him more than any argument ever could. He reached for his phone, scrolling without really seeing, searching for something familiar, something that would restore the sense of momentum he was used to, but everything felt distant, disconnected, like he was standing just outside the version of his life he thought he understood. Back inside, a quiet knock sounded on Evelyn's office door, and when she opened it, the manager stood there, his expression respectful, composed. "Everything is running smoothly," he said, and she nodded once. A small acknowledgement that carried trust rather than oversight, because she did not need to control every detail to know it was working. As she stepped back into the hallway, the soft hum of the restaurant returning around her, she did not think about him again. Not in the way she once would have, not with questions or lingering emotions, but with a kind of clarity that came from distance, from understanding that closure was not something given. It was something built quietly over time until one day it simply existed. And as she walked back into the dining room, the light catching in the glass and the steady rhythm of the evening continuing without interruption, there was no sense of victory, no need for acknowledgement, only the quiet, undeniable truth that she had not just moved on from her past, she had outgrown it completely, and somewhere in the distance, without even realizing it yet, Daniel was beginning to understand that too. The night stretched on, but for Daniel, time had begun to lose its usual shape, each step forward feeling less like progress and more like distance from something he could no longer define. And as he reached the edge of a quieter street, he slowed again, the city noise fading just enough to leave space for his thoughts to surface in ways he had spent years avoiding. He told himself it did not matter, that it was just one moment, one unexpected encounter, but the image refused to fade away. The room had shifted around her, the way no one questioned her presence, the way he had been the only one out of place without realizing it. He leaned briefly against a cool metal railing, looking out at the reflection of streetlights in a darkened window, and for a second he saw himself there, not the version he presented to the world, but something quieter, less certain, and it unsettled him more than anything that had happened inside. Across the city, Evelyn continued moving through her. Evening, the steady rhythm of service unfolding with quiet precision, each table attended to, each detail accounted for, and yet there was a subtle shift within her as well. Not disruption, not unease, but awareness, the kind that comes when a closed chapter briefly opens just enough to prove it no longer has power. She paused near the bar, exchanging a few quiet words with the bartender, her tone calm, her posture relaxed. And as she turned, her gaze passed once more across the room, not searching, not expecting, just present, fully anchored in the life she had built piece by piece. Years ago, she had stood in rooms where she felt invisible, where her voice carried less weight, where her value had been measured against someone else's expectations, and she remembered that feeling not as a wound, but as a contrast, something that made the present sharper, clearer, undeniable. Outside, Daniel pushed himself away from the railing, straightening his coat as if the motion alone could restore something that had slipped, but the feeling remained, subtle and persistent. And as he continued walking, he found himself replaying moments he had long dismissed, conversations he had controlled, decisions he had made without hesitation, all of them now reframed under a different light, one he had not chosen but could not ignore. He thought about the way she had looked at him, not with anger, not with regret, but with something else entirely, something that suggested she had already moved beyond the space he still occupied, and that realization settled in slowly, like a truth that did not need to be spoken to be understood. Inside the restaurant, a couple near the window laughed softly, their glasses catching the light as Evelyn approached to check on them, her smile warm, genuine, and completely unburdened by the past that had briefly intersected her evening. And as she listened, as she responded, as she moved seamlessly from one moment to the next, it became clear that her life was no longer something she defended. It was something she lived, fully and without hesitation. The manager crossed the room, giving her a small nod, a silent confirmation that everything remained in place. And she returned it with equal ease, because this space, this rhythm, this quiet authority was not temporary. It was earned, built through choices that no one else had made for her. Daniel reached another intersection, the light changing from red to green without him noticing at first. And when he finally stepped forward, it was with a slower certainty, not the confident stride he had walked in with earlier, but something more measured, more aware, as if each step now carried a weight he had never accounted for before. And somewhere between where he had been and where he was going, he began to understand that the story he believed he controlled had shifted, not because she had taken anything from him, but because she had built something he could no longer reach. By the time the restaurant began to quiet, the energy in the room had softened into something slower, more intimate, the kind of late evening rhythm where conversations dipped lower and laughter became quieter. And Evelyn stood near the back, watching it all with the same steady awareness that had carried her through every hour of the night, her hands resting lightly against the edge of a table as a server cleared the last set of plates. And there was a calm in her now that was deeper than the surface, not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something stronger. She stepped toward the window for a moment, the glass cool beneath her fingertips as she looked out at the city beyond, the lights stretching endlessly, each one representing a life moving forward without pause. And she realized that tonight had not been about him returning. It had been about her not needing him to. Years ago, she would have replayed every word, every glance, searching for meaning, questioning herself, wondering what she could have done differently. But now, there was no question left to answer, no validation left to seek, only the quiet certainty of who she had become. Behind her, the staff continued their work, resetting tables, folding linens, preparing for the next day. And as she turned back, she caught a glimpse of their movements, the quiet respect in the way they carried themselves around her. Not forced, not exaggerated, but earned, and it grounded her in a way that no external approval ever could. Across the city, Daniel finally reached his apartment building, the familiar glass doors sliding open with a soft mechanical hum. And for a moment, he hesitated before stepping inside, the reflection staring back at him from the polished surface sharper now, less forgiving, and he paused just long enough to recognize something he had been avoiding, that the confidence he relied on had always been tied to environments he could control, to narratives he could shape, and tonight had taken that away without effort. He stepped into the elevator, the doors closing with a quiet finality, and as the numbers climbed, he leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed ahead, but his thoughts pulling him backward, not to the relationship itself, but to the assumptions he had made, the way he had defined success, the way he had measured worth, and how easily those definitions had collapsed in a room he thought he understood. Back at the restaurant, Evelyn moved through the final checks of the evening, her steps unhurried, her focus clear, and when the last guest stepped out and the doors closed, the space shifted into stillness, the kind that comes not from emptiness, but from completion, and she stood there for a moment, taking it in, not as a victory, but as a continuation. She reached for the light near the entrance, pausing briefly before turning it down, the warm glow dimming just enough to soften the edges of the room. And as she did, her reflection appeared once more in the glass, steady, composed, unchanged by anything that had tried to disturb it. Daniel stepped out of the elevator into a silence that felt different from the quiet of the restaurant, heavier, less controlled, and as he unlocked his door and stepped inside, the stillness followed him, settling into the corners of a space that suddenly felt less complete than it had that morning, and he stood there for a moment without moving, the events of the night settling into place in a way he could no longer rearrange, somewhere between the version of himself he had believed in and the reality he had just faced. Something had shifted permanently, and though he could not yet name it, he could feel it in the way his thoughts slowed, in the way his certainty hesitated, in the way the silence around him no longer felt like control, but like something waiting to be understood. And back across the city, in a restaurant that no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, Evelyn turned the final light off and walked away without looking back. Morning arrived without ceremony, the city already in motion before Daniel fully opened his eyes, sunlight slipping through the blinds in thin, sharp lines that stretched across the floor and climbed slowly toward the ceiling. And for a moment he lay still, staring at the unfamiliar quiet of his own thoughts, because the usual clarity he relied on was gone, replaced by something slower, heavier, something that refused to be organized into neat conclusions. He sat up, running a hand over his face, the memory of the night before not fading as he expected, but sharpening, every detail clearer now, the way she had stood there, composed, unshaken, The way the room had responded to her without question, and the realization settled deeper this time. Not as surprise, but as fact. Across the city, Evelyn unlocked the restaurant door. Just as the early light began to soften the edges of the street, the air still cool, carrying the faint scent of fresh pavement and distant coffee. And as she stepped inside, the space greeted her with a quiet familiarity, the polished surfaces catching the morning glow, the stillness waiting to be shaped into another day. She moved through the dining room with steady purpose, checking details that most people would never notice, adjusting a chair by half an inch, aligning a glass so it caught the light just right, small movements that reflected something much larger, a discipline built over time, a sense of ownership that went beyond the physical space. Daniel stood in his kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee he had not touched, his reflection faint in the dark surface of the window, and he realized that what unsettled him most was not her success, but the absence of him in it. The undeniable truth that whatever she had built without him, without his approval, without the version of reality he had once imposed. He picked up his phone, hesitating for a second longer than he wanted to admit, then setting it back down without unlocking it, because there was nothing he could say that would restore what had shifted, nothing that would place him back into a story he no longer belonged to. Inside the restaurant, the staff began to arrive one by one, their greetings quiet, respectful, the rhythm of preparation unfolding naturally around Evelyn as she moved between them, offering direction when needed, stepping back when it was not, her presence steady but never overwhelming. And as the morning built into something brighter, the space transformed again, not dramatically, but seamlessly, as if it had always known what it was meant to be. Daniel stepped outside onto his balcony, the city stretching out before him, alive with motion, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel ahead of it. He felt behind it, as if something had moved forward without him, and he had only just noticed. And as he stood there, the cool air pressing lightly against his skin, he began to understand that the control he believed he had was never absolute. It had simply never been challenged in a way that forced him to see it clearly. Back inside, Evelyn paused near the entrance as the first reservation of the day approached her. Posture relaxed, her expression calm, and as she welcomed them in, her voice warm, grounded, entirely present, it became clear that nothing about her life required validation from the past. Nothing about her success needed explanation, and somewhere between the quiet certainty of her world and the unsettled stillness of his, a distance had formed that could not be closed by memory, by pride, or by anything he had once relied on, because some distances are not created by time. They are created by growth, and once they exist, they do not disappear. They simply remain undeniable and complete. The second day did not begin with hesitation for Evelyn. It began with momentum, the kind that comes from years of building something piece by piece until it no longer feels fragile. And as the lunch crowd settled into the restaurant, the familiar rhythm returned, steady and controlled, the quiet orchestration of movement, timing, and presence that defined everything she had created. She stood near the center of the room, not to be seen, but because that was where she could feel the space best, where she could sense the subtle shifts before anyone else noticed them, the slight delay in service, the tone of a conversation, the unspoken signals that told her everything was working exactly as it should. Across town, Daniel sat in a glass-walled office that had once felt like a symbol of progress, the skyline stretching behind him in clean, sharp lines, but today it felt different. Less like a vantage point and more like a distance, as if he were observing something he no longer fully understood. His laptop sat open, emails waiting, notifications stacking, but his attention drifted, pulled back again to a moment he could not rewrite, a moment that refused to shrink no matter how much he tried to rationalize it. He told himself it was briefly near the bar, her gaze lifting as sunlight filtered through the windows, catching on glass and polished surfaces, and in that quiet moment, there was no trace of the past, no lingering tension, only the steady continuation of something she had built entirely on her own terms. And as the room filled with conversation, movement, In life, it became clear that what had shifted was not just one moment, but an entire perspective, one that no longer required her to prove anything to anyone. And somewhere across the city, Daniel stood still, beginning to understand that the version of the world he had relied on was not gone. It had simply never been as complete as he believed, and now, for the first time, he could see what had been there all along. By late afternoon, the restaurant carried a different kind of energy, softer than the rush of lunch, but sharper in its intention. The kind of hour where decisions were made over quiet conversations, and every detail mattered more than it appeared. And Evelyn stood near the entrance, reviewing a reservation list with calm focus, her fingers tracing down the names not out of necessity, but out of habit, a discipline that had become second nature. The door opened, letting in a brief draft of cool air, and for a moment, she did not look up, not immediately, because she no longer reacted to every entrance the way she once might have, but something in the shift of presence made her lift her gaze, not sharply, just enough to acknowledge what had changed. Daniel stepped inside alone this time. There was no performance in his posture now, no exaggerated confidence, just a controlled stillness that felt deliberate, as if each movement had been measured before it happened, and the space around him did not react the way it had before, not because he held power here, but because the room no longer belonged to him in any way. Evelyn did not move toward him right away. She allowed the moment to exist without interruption, her expression steady, her breathing even, and as their eyes met across the distance, there was no surprise left, only recognition of what had already been set in motion. Daniel approached slowly, the sound of his steps softer than the night before, his gaze not scanning the room this time, not claiming it, but acknowledging it for what it was. And when he stopped a few feet from her, there was a pause that carried more weight than any words he might have chosen. "I did not know," he said finally, his voice low, stripped of the edge it once carried, and the sentence lingered, incomplete but honest in a way that surprised even him. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment, not searching for meaning, not waiting for explanation, just allowing the words to exist as they were. And when she responded, her tone was calm, grounded. "You were not meant to," and there was no accusation in it, no bitterness, just clarity, the kind that does not need to defend itself. Daniel exhaled slowly, glancing briefly around the room. The same room that had exposed him the night before, but now it felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had just enough to see it clearly, and he nodded once, as if accepting something he could not undo. "You built all of this," he said, the statement quiet, almost reflective, and Evelyn did not look away, did not soften, did not claim it as a victory. She simply answered, "Yes," because there was no need to expand on what was already evident. A server passed behind her, pausing briefly as if waiting for direction, and with a small, almost imperceptible gesture, she acknowledged them, the kind of interaction that spoke more clearly than any title ever could. And Daniel noticed it this time, not as a disruption, but as confirmation. He shifted, slightly, the space between them unchanged, but the meaning of it entirely different. And for a moment, it seemed as if he might say more, might reach for something that could reconnect the past to the present. But the impulse faded before it formed, because even he understood now that some distances are not meant to be crossed again. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had reached its natural end. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm certainty. "If you would like a table, we can arrange that." And the offer was simple, professional, complete, leaving no room for interpretation beyond what it was. Daniel gave a small shake of his head, a faint smile touching his expression, not of amusement, but of recognition. And as he stepped back, the decision already made, he understood something he had not the night before, that this was not a place he had lost. It was a place he had never belonged to, not in the way she did, not in the way she had built it. He turned toward the door, the movement steady, unforced, and as he stepped outside once more, the evening light catching briefly on the glass behind him, the reflection that followed was no longer something he tried to control, and inside, Evelyn returned to the rhythm of the room without hesitation, The moment already settled, already complete, because some endings do not require closure. They simply reveal that everything has already been decided. The evening settled into its quiet elegance once more, the soft glow of the chandeliers casting warm reflections across glass and polished wood, and Evelyn moved through the space with the same steady presence, untouched by what had just passed, as if the moment had simply folded into the larger rhythm of her life without leaving a mark. A couple near the center table raised their glasses in quiet celebration. A server passed with practiced ease, and the subtle harmony of the room continued, uninterrupted, because nothing here depended on what had happened at the door. Nothing here required acknowledgement of a past that no longer held weight. She paused briefly near the window again, her reflection faint in the glass, the city stretching beyond it in layers of light and motion. And for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the difference, not as triumph, but as clarity. The kind that settles in after something long, unresolved finally reveals itself as complete. Years ago, she would have searched for meaning in his return, questioned the timing, wondered what it meant that he had come back. But now, there was no question left to answer, because his presence had not changed anything. It had only confirmed what was already true. Behind her, the manager approached with a quiet update about the evening reservations, his tone respectful, his posture relaxed, and she listened, nodding once, her focus already returning to the present, because that was where everything that mattered existed now. Across the street, Daniel stood for a moment longer than necessary, the restaurant behind him, the city in front of him, and the space between those 2 points felt larger than it should have, not because of distance, but because of what it represented, a divide he could not cross, not with words, not with memory, not with anything he had once relied on. He glanced back once, not out of hope, but out of acknowledgement, the kind that comes when something is finally understood. And through the glass, he could see her moving through the room, calm, composed, entirely within her own world. And for the first time, he did not imagine himself stepping back into it. He simply observed it for what it was. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to allow something else to take its place. Not regret, not quite acceptance, but something closer to awareness, the recognition that not every ending is loud, not every loss is immediate. Some unfold quietly, over time, until one day there's nothing left to reclaim. Inside, Evelyn turned from the window, her steps unhurried, her attention shifting seamlessly back to the details of the evening. And, as she passed the table, a guest thanked her by name, the familiarity in their voice effortless, earned, and she responded with a small smile, not because she needed to, but because it reflected exactly who she had become. The room continued to move around her, not because she controlled it, but because she had created something that no longer required control to function, something stable, something real. And as the night carried on, there was no sense of anything unfinished, no lingering tension waiting to be resolved, only the steady continuation of a life built on her own terms. Outside, Daniel finally turned away from the glass, the reflection fading as he stepped into the flow of the city, his pace steady, his direction clear in a way it had not been before, not because he had regained control, but because he had lost the illusion of it. And somewhere between where he had been and where he was going, the understanding settled fully, that what he had witnessed was not just her success, but her freedom, and that was something he had never truly given her, and could never take back.